Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I'm Paul Rogers, and I'm loosely chairing this. I'm delighted to say we have an additional panelist, Jinsella, who is very much involved in this very interesting new group, demilitarized education, working with universities in many really very innovative ways. And we're delighted that she can join us. And then, of course, there's Jeremy, who will be speaking as the main speaker. And then I will come up with a few ideas, few thoughts, and then it'll be open. We'll make sure there is time for questions and discussion. Jeremy was here, 2 years ago? He wasn't here last year because of the general election, but I seem to remember we had a pretty full hall then. I think we're even fuller here, so to over 1,000 people. So it's really good to see so many people here. So that'll be the order of speakers, plenty of time for discussion. And so I'll ask Jinsella if she would like to start off by telling us more about this extraordinary group and how it's developing. Yours.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Yes, so we are talking about the arms trade today and the war machine. And one thing that is constantly forgotten in this narrative of how we're understanding the war supply chains is our education system. And this is what my organization really looks at. We are a community and guide for modern-day peacemakers, and we work to break the ties between universities and the arms trade. In doing that, we have created the world's first university and arms database and have so far uncovered over £2 billion worth of university partnerships with the arms trade. Now, this means they are partnering with them with research. So an arms company will buy out the university space and develop arms-orientated research. Academic partnerships, so we're talking about consultancy, promoting careers fairs, and so on. And then we have investments. So that's kind of the university's side hustle. It's the easiest strategy point for divestment. And it's when a university will actually buy shares in an arms company, usually through investment pools, and will be profiting from the surge of profits in conflict time. What we are using that data to do is to campaign for adoption of the Demilitarized Education Treaty. And this is a framework for policy renewal, which looks at disclosure, you know, that major pillar of our democracy where we actually know what's going on in these major institutions. That's the first step, of course, transparency, so we can really understand what's going wrong to improve it. Then we're focusing on inclusion of a policy renewal process, so to see investment, academic, and research policies exclude arms companies. Now, this is where we're looking at the major economic impact of education and the arms trade. Higher education, of course. It's very reliant and very influential in terms of the way our economy is being built. And sadly, as our politics is too, it is largely marketized. And this is a real issue in the way that we are using our great knowledge centers to promote a better future. We at Demilitarized Education truly believe that our education system is the architecture of our societies and should be leading and have the capacity to really drive transformational change that we need in our economy. But that isn't possible while arms companies are being welcomed in to buy out that space. And of course, this is a trickle-down agenda, and it goes much further down than just universities. In primary and secondary schools, there is a much stronger ideological push to normalize military doctrine, which of course has completely changed over the past few decades. It's no longer a doctrine of preparing for military service or wars that we might be involved in, and it is now a lobbying institution that is being used to influence the public and the government to be able to continue our current defense mechanisms as they are. And what are they? They are commercial imperialist entities, and that is no longer what our society needs and hasn't been for a long time. We are working with the National Education Union, and over 500,000 members have already voted to support the Disarm Education affiliation. And I want all of you, we're all connected to the education system. We all have children, we've been to schools, they're such central parts of our local economies in all spaces, to be looking for ways to support the critique of military the critique of military and arms companies being welcomed into our educational spaces. This is a leverage point for us to all be scrutinizing their presence. And just for a bit of context, I was contacted by a mother at Lossiemouth High School a few years ago. Very worried mother, because the high school she was about to send her children to had just renamed their school houses after RAF fighter jets. And that went ahead. The community hubs that those children are now gathering around are literally named after fighter jets. I get constant emails from people having RAF visits in their food tech classes. And of course, we have the cadet system, a really inspiring opportunity where children are able to go out of school and do really cool things like gliding aeroplanes and so on. But what we're not being clearly communicated with is the fact that that, of course, is manipulation. Manipulation into continued war, giving social license to all our generations that war is the normal way to defend ourselves. And, of course, it is not. It is an evil way that, as we're seeing all across the world, is making things far less safe and far less beautiful. So, I want to just add to that final comment as well about how much of our money is going into that. Since 2012, over £90 million of British taxpayers' money has been spent promoting military ethos in schools. And the military ethos is the need to aggressively defend our own interest and be prepared to use violence to do so. This has to stop. And in the educational space, we are winning. We have just seen King's College Cambridge change their investment policy to no longer work with arms companies. We're seeing that at York University. King's College London, which for many of you who might not know, has a huge war department and is largely funded curriculum-based control from the from the Ministry of Defence as well. They actually just changed their investment policy to no longer work with weapons companies that build controversial weapons. This is a huge, huge shift in precedent and something that the campaigners across the country and world are really proud that they pressured the institution to no longer want to deal with such organisations. However, BAE Systems doesn't make controversial weapons. They only make conventional weapons. So you can see straight away how that is a major loophole that allowed King's College London to give us all glitter, no gold. And that is that is a representation of how powerful this movement is, how much influence we have to be able to make an institution like that actually shift its ways, but how much more we need to come together to make sure that they are actually doing what they need to be doing. And that is creating institutions that literally put their capacity towards peace building rather than perpetual war. So yes, please do check us out, Demilitarized Education. We have data on most universities in the country, and we're just in the midst of a mass data collection at the moment. So by the end of the year, that 2 billion will be going up dramatically. So check us out, support our work. We have many resources, many reports, and most importantly, please all look to your educational spaces, and wherever you see military presence, wherever you see arms company presence, resist it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jinsella. So now over to Jeremy. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for all you just said about education and the issues that are facing young people and the way our education institutions are being pressurized by defense interests and the arms industry. I want to just go back to a slightly wider picture, if I could, for a moment. We live in extraordinarily dangerous times where we now have wars going on in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Yemen, and also conflicts going on in Indonesia over West Papua, and a number of other conflicts around the world that don't necessarily get so much publicity. And these wars are taking huge numbers of lives, and I'll come back to it in a moment, but you look at what's happening daily on our screens in Gaza and the West Bank, and it's like live streaming of the Hunger Games. It's something that is, to me, beyond disgusting to have to watch this on television. And the loss of life in all of these wars is enormous. Conscripted Ukrainian soldiers killing Russian conscripted soldiers, and so on. And a huge volume of armaments flowing in from both sides into it. And don't think there isn't arms industry interests as well in Russia, just as much as there are in the West as well, who are all profiting from that particular war. And then you look at the causes of those wars and the environmental damage that's done and the danger of a descent into something even worse in the future, with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty being effectively parked by the declared nuclear weapon states, therefore making it open season for others who are not declared nuclear weapon states within the terms of the NPT to develop their own nuclear weapons. And so whilst there was a lot of complaints, concern of the idea that Iran could develop nuclear weapons, they didn't actually have nuclear weapons. And whilst I don't think anybody should have nuclear weapons, Iran clearly didn't have them at the point when the US sent in its bunker-busting bombs. But Israel does have nuclear weapons and has the capability of delivering them. So the dangers of descending into a nuclear war are really, really serious. In order to try and understand what's happening at the present time, I think we have to look at the historical parallel of what happened at the turn of the 19th and 20th century through to the First World War and beyond. Pre-Boer War, there was a massive colonial and trade competition between the European imperial powers, Britain, France, Germany, and to some extent Russia, around the world. The First World War broke out because there were a series of often secret, interlocking security and defense agreements between different countries. So from the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, within a few weeks, that became the First World War, and that then became the slaughter ground of the Western Front and all the millions of soldiers that died as a result of that particular war. We descended into that particular conflict. And those that spoke for peace were rapidly ignored and forgotten by most people, but not all. Keir Hardie, for example, was the leader of the Labour Party at the time. He opposed the First World War. He was shouted down in Parliament by his own parliamentary party, who sang the national anthem as he was trying to say why this war was catastrophic and dangerous for the working class of this country. I think he should be forever remembered as a hero for his bravery in speaking out at that time. He died only a year later from a heart attack. But that war was also about global influence and also about global trade. Fast forward to now, and what do we have but Donald Trump as President of the United States promoting MAGA, Make America Great Again, easy, simplistic slogan without ever defining exactly what it means. At one level, people latch onto it and say, well, we don't want more wars around the world, therefore Trump bringing everything back home and returning to American isolationism might be a good thing. But then look beyond it or behind it, and what you see is a thirst and a grab for precious metals, raw materials, oil all around the world. Look at the deals being done in Ukraine over rare earths, and look at the deals being done in other places, particularly the DRC, where suddenly Donald Trump's taken an interest in the peace movement there in return for gaining access to the mineral wealth of the DRC. So you see a big conflict developing. But what is often ignored in all this is an enormous global shift in power and influence at the present time. The United States is, yes, the world's most powerful military force in the world has ever known. That's clearly the case. It's also the most powerful and largest indebted nation anywhere in the world. And for all his rhetoric about making America great again and passing his big, beautiful bill through the Senate and the House, he's actually increased the US federal debt, which is where he and Elon Musk have fallen out. And so if you want a real theatre show for the next 3 years, watch the Musk and Trump show. It's going to be something else, those two, because they've both got stupendous amounts of money to spend abusing each other. So it could be quite entertaining. I suspect it will all end in tears all round. But the difference is that the BRICS nations are becoming stronger and more powerful. The BRICS summit that's taking place in Rio next week is an important thing. And the change of the trading currency away from the dollar and the euro towards a BRICS-based currency is a highly significant move in terms of world trade and the direction in which southern nations begin to look in the future. So I think we need to think through these things very, very seriously and very, very carefully, and what our response to these has to be. Now, if you take the British point of view or participation in all this historically, Britain joined NATO in 1948, indeed was probably one of the major founding nations of NATO. And ever since then, essentially, it's driven British defence and foreign policy in a very, very big way. And if you're a British politician in a public space and you dare to question the strategy that's being followed in respect of NATO, then there's a big political price to be paid and a huge amount of attacks that are made on that individual. Trust me, I know. You then ask yourself the question, well, what have we actually done when there's been great opportunities? Cold War came to an end, roughly speaking, in 1990. And throughout the 90s, there was, generally speaking, and Paul will confirm me if I'm wrong on this, a reduction in defence expenditure. There was a greater understanding of the need and possibility of reducing the number of nuclear warheads. There was the ABM Treaty and others that began to bring about a more rational relationship, albeit with post-Soviet Union Russia, between them and the United States and in Western Europe. And we then had 9/11, we then had an increase in arms expenditure, and you then begin to see the turning point, which was possibly Afghanistan in 2001, but Iraq 2 years later, where both of those wars sucked up vast amounts of resources, cost tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives in both respects, and both ended, frankly, in disaster. And I can hear myself what I was saying at the big rally we had in Hyde Park in 2003 against the Iraq War. I said, this war will create the instability, the hatred, the terrorism, and the wars of tomorrow. And sadly, that's exactly what's happened. We then went on to have wars in Syria and Libya, and it's gone on ever since then. So you then have to ask yourself the question, in this current atmosphere, driven in part by an analysis of what's going on in the Ukraine, there's been a huge increase in defence expenditure all across Europe. Ursula von der Leyen of the European Union has successfully managed to persuade most of the EU that they have to become a European armed force, developed an arms-making industry all across Europe, and tried to promote greater levels of arms expenditure in each country. And every NATO summit or every G7 summit, there seems to be a further ratcheting up of defence expenditure. At the present time, Britain spends around 2.6% of GDP on defence. That is rising very, very rapidly, and the Prime Minister confirmed last week it's going to go up very quickly to at least 4%, with the aim ultimately to go up to 5%, which is, roughly speaking, a doubling of what we had a couple of years ago. And the effects of those expenditure rises are enormous. The government tried to take $5 billion out of the personal independence payments budget in order to increase defence expenditure. They've already ruined or destroyed overseas aid in order to put more into defence. And so we are becoming a country that is spending more and more and more on weapons and arms, and giving ourselves a global role, which even Harold Wilson rolled back from in the 1960s. Successive governments until Boris Johnson basically said they didn't want to go back to the global role for Britain. Under Boris Johnson, we did, with the construction of 2 aircraft carriers, and now Starmer has proposed the purchasing of a whole new fleet of F-35 jets that are capable of carrying airborne nuclear weapons around the world, presumably deciding that the Trident submarine system is either inefficient or out of date, or they just want to increase the nuclear capacity. So these are truly dangerous times. What I find so sad and depressing is that when the government produced its Strategic Defence Review document about a month ago, there was almost no debate in Parliament about it. There were no more than 4 or 5 MPs that asked anything remotely critical of the concept of going to this enormous level of arms expenditure for this country. I was one of them. And the alternatives that have been put forward, I've got a copy of an excellent alternative that's been put forward here called Alternative Defence Review, produced by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Paul was one of those that helped in the assembly of the information in it. And it is a fascinating document because what it does is challenges the levels of spending, and what it does also is challenging the government Strategic Defence Review, in which the word peace barely appears. There is no concept of giving greater and better resources to the United Nations or to the World Food Programme or to UNESCO or any of the other UN agencies which can be vehicles for peace and equal development and sustainability around the world. And so the issues that we're facing today are about how we deal with all of this. Now, I've been involved in a lot of campaigns with CND and many other groups over the years on the issues of defence spending. There needs to be an alternative, but it doesn't mean you have to condemn everybody that works in the arms industry, that works for Rolls-Royce, works for British Aerospace or any of the other companies. You have to look for alternatives. These alternatives have been produced before. Many years ago, there was the Lucas Aerospace workers produced an alternative defence review. After that, there were a number of documents produced by a number of trade unions. The Transport and General Workers Union, the predecessor union for Unite the Union, produced its own documents on this and proposed its own policies towards the TUC and the Labour Party. And the former General Secretary of the union, Len McCluskey, is here in the audience this afternoon because we're doing a poetry event later on tonight. And he and I were just talking about this a few moments ago. So it is about having an alternative of how you go forward, in that we spend more on producing good quality, sustainable, environmentally appropriate goods, rather than going deeper and deeper into higher levels of defence expenditure, which means that our governments have to have a strategy to bring about peace rather than endlessly preparing for more war. It's that voice for peace that's so often missing in all the communiques and discussions that are put forward. Take Ukraine, for example. The European Union either didn't try or was monumentally unsuccessful in trying to negotiate a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. At the point when the Minsk II agreement could have been reached, Boris Johnson intervened to say he didn't want any of that. He wanted it to be cancelled and to continue the war. That was one of the last throes of Boris Johnson's premiership. And the only people that seriously tried to bring about a ceasefire were the late Pope, the African Union, and some of the Latin American leaders, notably President Lula of Brazil. Where were we in all that? Couldn't we have done something? Couldn't we have tried in some way? I'm not defending Russia's operations. I'm not defending Russia's policy. But I hate to see the killing that's going on in Ukraine. There has to be a process for peace. And the last thing I'd say is about where I started, the current war that's going on in Gaza and the West Bank. It is horrific beyond belief what we're all seeing on our televisions. And the dogged way in which our government has been dragged kicking and screaming to even the idea of reducing arms supplies to Israel is only because of the huge number of demonstrations and protests that have been happening over the past 18 months in particular. And we, Britain, are still supplying F-35 parts. 15% of the components of those planes go into the global supply chain, and the government has admitted to me directly, knowing full well that those planes are going to be used to bomb hospitals and schools and homes in Gaza. It is appalling beyond belief. But this policy doesn't come from nowhere. South Africa, a country that freed itself from apartheid, had the bravery to take Israel to the International Court of Justice on the charge of genocide. I was there at the hearing in The Hague, and it was very moving to hear the South African government, thrown off apartheid, taking this action. Well done them. So this policy didn't come from nowhere. And after the Iraq War, or during it, a number of us wanted a full inquiry into how Britain had got into the Iraq War, what the legal basis was, what the costs were, what the pressures were, and so on. And there were 3 inquiries: the Butler inquiry, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee inquiry, and then finally the Sir John Chilcot inquiry, which eventually came out in 2016. I think we should do the same over the policy in relation to arms supply to Israel and the effects that this has had on the Palestinian people. And so I have produced a private member's bill in Parliament called the Gaza Independent Public Inquiry Bill. And I got through its first stage in Parliament, but since then it's been blocked with great enthusiasm by the government. And so in order to ensure that an inquiry does take place, our project, the Peace and Justice Project, is organising an open 2-day public inquiry into Britain's policy in relation to arms supplies and the effect they've had on breaches of humanitarian law and the conventions on genocide in Gaza and the effects on the Palestinian people. And that will be held in September. I could go on for too long, and I can see Paul becoming slightly concerned. So I will stop there just to say it's very important that we do have, and I'm very grateful and very thankful to the Bradford Literary Festival for giving us this space this afternoon for this kind of issue and this kind of discussion to reach a much wider audience, because we're in very dangerous times when our media will not report dissent, when our media will not report alternatives, but only go down the narrative of more money on more weapons gives us greater security. And when I see children living in poverty in my constituency, and I see the amount of money that's going into super sophisticated weapons, I know where I'd rather put the money. I'll stop there.
It's curious, isn't it, that the person who probably popularized the idea of military-industrial complexes was actually President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1960. He had been the Supreme Allied Commander in the closing stages of the Second World War, and he'd just come to the end of his second term as a president of the US in basically on the Republican side. And he talked about the way in which these complexes had developed and had huge power of their own. And he talked about this at some length, and it was the main theme of his final speech, as presidents do give at the end of their time. The point is that the idea of the military-industrial complex needs teasing out a bit. First, you get them in any state that has reasonably large armed forces or large defense industries, or more commonly, a common of both. So essentially, you have military-industrial complexes in countries like Britain, France, the United States, China, Russia, India, Germany, right across the board. And even you get them in countries which are known in the past or even in the present for neutrality. So Switzerland has a major group of arms companies. Sweden, which has now more or less given up its neutrality, is the same way, and it goes right across the system. The complexes themselves have many interesting features. One is they are bodies which act as very strong lobbies for their causes, and the causes obviously are the defense of the particular country. But as Jeremy was saying, it's the nature of that defense and the approach of the defense which is the major problem. So, for example, within the arms trade system, it has become highly profitable. You look back at the last, 2 or 3 years, in the first 18 months of the Ukraine war, BAE Systems, one of the world's largest arms companies, founded initially in Britain, its share prices went up by 60%. Saab, the big arms company in Sweden, went up by 100%. And Rheinmetall, the very big German company, went up by 200%. That was really the profitability that stemmed from the nature of the wars. And one has to say, and it's a difficult way of putting it, if you take the Ukraine war from the perspective of an arms salesperson, it's almost an ideal war. Why is that? Well, essentially, chances are that your own country producing the arms won't be directly involved in most Western cases, not directly involved. You will find that, difficult to know how to put it, in a sense, the whole idea is to develop new forms of killing and new forms of selling. And by combining these, you produce a system in which money can be made even more easily. And essentially, you have a system in which all the different groups work together, the military, the civil servants, the arms companies themselves, universities, think tanks, intelligence agencies, they all work more or less as one, with a huge amount of sort of, I suppose you would call it, revolving doors in many ways. And that really is at root because people believe that obviously profitability is important, but they believe that you look at the way in which you defend a country in a very narrow way. What I find extraordinary, and Jeremy was pointing out to some of the strategic reviews we've had recently, I've been through those reviews. They make virtually no mention of the fact that Britain has been involved in 3, possibly 4, failing wars in the last 25 years, ones which were expected to, quote, succeed. You look at Afghanistan. Essentially, within a few months, the Taliban had gone, Al-Qaeda had been dispersed. And then we went into a 20-year war long, with the long war, with Al-Qaeda coming up still there, and the Taliban basically in charge, and the position of women even worse than it had been before the start of the war. You look at Iraq. Within 3 weeks, it looked like the Saddam Hussein regime had gone. Just a few months later, Bush gave his famous mission accomplished speech on the deck of an aircraft carrier off the California coast, and the war lasted 8 years, and even now, Iraq is in great difficulties through the growth of different militias and the rest. You look at Libya, you look at the air war against ISIS between 2014 and 18, which is reckoned to have killed 70,000 people. It was hardly reported at the time, but that was a sort of loss. So you have these failed wars, and they're more or less ignored in a major defense review. What seems to be quite incredible, though, I think anybody will accept that 2 of the really big problems we face worldwide are marginalization and the wealth-poverty divide for one, and the second one, without question, probably the most important of all, is climate breakdown. It hardly figures in either the defense review or the strategic review. Virtually nothing is said about it. Essentially, we are basically closing our eyes to the biggest single challenge that we all have. And instead of which we pour money into defense, we pour money into the military, better term to use than defense, and essentially where we're ending up with is a system which is even more dangerous than before. That doesn't mean that things can change. I should perhaps mention at one stage, the original plan this afternoon was to have a book signing by Jeremy for the book which you would have heard about, The Monstrous Anger of the Guns. We cannot do that, and that is because of legal issues. Because under the new regulations that came in at midnight yesterday, they had the whole issue of the status of Palestine action. And essentially, because there was a brief chapter of that in the book, we have been told that it would be very unwise to promote it in public. Curiously, that doesn't mean that it can't be sold in regular bookshops, as you could this afternoon if you wish. But for the moment, things are so uncertain that we're going to not be able to actually run the signing. Apart from anything else, it could be put at risk for the publishers themselves. I'm sorry about that, but that is where we are. I mentioned that for two reasons. One, we seem to have, not just in Britain, but in many governments, a closing up of debate. You see it almost by the day in the United States, but you're seeing it in countries like Britain as well. That, I think, is in many ways really insidious, and we're missing out what's happening with it. So that, I think, we really do have to remember as a major problem in the future. More generally, there's the issue of the nature of protest. But I will also point out to you an interesting bit of history which isn't commonly put together. Has nothing to do, perhaps, with what's going on, or maybe it does. And that is the huge role of non-violence resistance in so many cases. In fact, if you look worldwide at some of the biggest changes, some of the biggest improvements, some of the most progressive parts of human change in the last 100 or so years, you go back originally even as far as the Chartists, but certainly all the developments of trade unionism in the second half of the 19th century, much of that was down to non-violent pressure, strikes and the rest, which slowly helped change things around. Then you look, of course, at women's suffrage, and that was hugely significant. In Britain, certainly, but in many other countries as well. Changes over, so often non-violent, but a lot of violence used against the women, particularly in Britain. But again, it had an impact. You look further at what was happening in the 1930s, again missed out the influence of Gandhi and what happened in India and its effect on the rate of decolonization from 1945 onwards. Historic, it's never looked at. This was actually very largely non-violent on the part of the people wanting the change. Violence against them, certainly, but non-violent themselves. And then you look at the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. Again, much violence against the people wanting the change, but primarily non-violence in the light of people like Martin Luther King. We also tend to forget the sudden changes at the end of the 1990s, solidarity in Poland, and many other examples across Eastern Europe, which hastened up basically the breaking down of the old, very rigid Soviet system. What I'm saying here is that we tend to forget what is also happening, what doesn't get into the public mind. Oxford Research Group, which was a group which existed for some years doing interesting research, they once published a book simply called War Prevention Works. I hope some stage it'll be possible to produce another edition. It went through 50 examples of conflicts, some small, some larger, which were largely brought to an end or even prevented from developing properly by these sorts of methods. So all I'm saying is I think we are at a time, as Jeremy say, I absolutely agree with him, we can all see this. This is one of the most dangerous parts we've been in. And I can remember the Cuban Missile Crisis and other huge dangers, particularly in the early 1980s. It is a dangerous period at present, and we've really got to recognize this, but we've also got to realize that things can change if enough of us are willing to sort of stand up and be counted and spread the word. And this is why, really just follow on and repeat, I'm sorry, for what Jeremy said, it's so important that there are opportunities like this to have wider discussions on a large scale. And it seems to me that's going to be very important for all of us here and for others as well. So let me now, we've got just a few minutes left, we've got more than 10 minutes left, if we can actually... Sorry.
Paul, you've just given me a really good idea. If you want to resurrect the idea of this book, my own book's just about finished. I need something to do. I'll do the book with you.
Okay. Okay, promise we're going to have Jeremy here next year if his book is published. That's his own memoirs. You promise that, right?
Yeah, we can do it as a group of essays or something. These things need to be out there. We need that debate. We need that discussion. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. We have some time for questions. You probably heard the term that academics fade away. Well, the reality is that academics tend to lose their faculties. which means...
Oh,
all right, it's
that's
a
the
formula.
old one.
It's the older. But the point is that I'm not as hearing as good as I was, so please speak up. I think we do have some roving mics. I hope we do. Is that right? We do, right? We have some roving mics.
I'm sure there's an audience out there, but I can't see it.
Yes, it's difficult to see the audience. Jack, is it possible to bring up the auditorium
get the-
lighting? Be hugely good for
The
us.
audio lights up a little bit, that kind of help, you know. Oh, there went mine. Oh, there are people there. Fantastic.
Yes.
Lovely to
An
see you
awful lot
all.
of people. Wow. Yes. Hello.
Great.
So, anybody like to ask the first question? Could I ask you? We've got 10 minutes actually, and keep the questions short, and I'll try and keep the answers short first. One down at the front here for starters, and I think it was down halfway through. Take this one first. There's a mic coming down, and say, please keep them brief. It works better that way.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. So how do we make peace attractive and profitable?
Well, how do we make peace? I think there's one thing. Quakers have a lovely saying, which, if war is the answer, it is a stupid question. And the point is that it's subtle, that, because what you're saying is that any sort of orientation, any discussion which is concerned with looking at things in that way is faulty from the ground up. And if people, you can remind people of this whenever you can, I think it's hugely important. But how do we make peace? Jeremy, and then Jinsella, if you give your views.
In this city, which has got such a wonderful record and history of peace campaigning and peace organizations, it's a great to be able to have this meeting here on that question. Peace isn't just the absence of war. The absence of war is not peace. The absence of war means that there is an ability to fight a war, but it's not actually happening at that time, but could break out. But you have to get there somehow. And that means you've got to negotiate a ceasefire in that particular conflict. You then have to start looking at what the issues are that brought the war about and see if there is some way forward. In the case of Russia-Ukraine, I would have thought the direction has to be something towards a Minsk II type of agreement. And if Russia and Ukraine are capable of meeting each other to exchange prisoners, or sadly to return dead bodies of fallen soldiers from both sides, or to negotiate grain sales, then obviously they're perfectly capable of talking to each other about some longer-term outcome to this particularly horrific conflict. Likewise, the possibility today of a ceasefire in Gaza means that there could be more aid going in. I hope it also is accompanied by the restoration of the UN's role in Gaza as a way of bringing about a longer-term settlement. And I'm not going to sit here and say how Gaza should be run or how the West Bank should be run. All I will say is occupation is wrong, and the Palestinian people should be the ones who decide the future of how they live and where they live in Gaza and the West Bank. It's not up to us to decide. But it's also about peace education, which we were just talking about, and how we deal with the teaching of history in our schools, and the, I think, danger of the militarization of our universities. I've done a lot of discussion meetings in universities over many years, and I'm quite appalled at the level of contractual arrangements between defense research companies and universities, which are in fact developing weapons of horrific potential in our universities. I was brought up with the idea that universities are places of academic independence and freedom of thought. It's not quite how it appears at the present time. So it's the teaching of history, it's the independence of our universities, it's opening our eyes to the possibilities of spending less on arms and dealing with the social issues that we face, and it's also a question of how we deal with the climate crisis and environmental crisis around the world. I'll finish on this. What is real security? Is real security the ability for me to kill my neighbor, or my neighbor's ability to kill me? Or is real security knowing that all of our children have got a doctor, all of our children have got a school, none of our children are starving, and everybody's got clean water as accessibility. For some people in many parts of the world, that would just be a pipe dream. Let's try and deal with the issues of poverty and inequality and environmental danger as the real issues facing our planet.
Great question. And I would just start by saying the power dynamics which control our economies are reliant on our obedience. And peace is an experience at every level of our economy. So wherever we're engaging with the need and the experience of peace, we need to take that very seriously in the context of the macro. And for us to be able to shift our economies away from this defense military thinking, and we say defense because it's clearly not that, we have to first, from my perspective, tackle our education system. Right now, young people are getting out of higher education, and even primary and secondary, with no hope. I call it a hope vacuum, because they are pushed the narrative that this is the way the world works, and there's no realistic way of changing it. And if you are serious about peace being profitable and achievable, you're naive. And we really have to tackle that head on. We have to make our social spaces which encourage belief, encourage hope. And I always say, as a start point, because peace starts from within, we have to believe in peace, not just in our own domestic scenarios, but world peace. We all want it. It is our universal goal. It is the universal principle that connects us. So we have to believe it. We have to be able to continue to push beyond the narratives that we and our children are being drip-fed, and understand that we are the crux of our economy, and peace is profitable. Diversification is possible and needed.
Further question near the back on this side, please.
Can you hear me? Yeah. My name's Ray Street. It is 50 years now since the Organisation Security, Common Security in Europe was formed. It was formed across Europe, including Russia, which was formed to achieve the end to conflict, which we've been talking about, without the military. But all we hear about now is NATO and more weapons, and that is supposed to bring about the security. And as our speakers have shown, it's just the wrong way to go about it. But OSCE has fallen off the radar. And my friends in Finland, it came after the Helsinki Accords in 1975. They say the spirit has been lost. How do we revive that spirit? How do we bring about education to people about how you can achieve peace through diplomacy and dialogue? How can we revive that spirit from 50 years ago? Because it definitely has been lost. And she said that in Finland, where it started in Helsinki, they're not going to celebrate it at all. Could you expand on that, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's a question which goes to the core of the sort of problems we face. Jeremy, we're almost out of time, but can I ask you to respond first?
Very quickly, yes.
Yeah.
I recognise that voice, and thank you for all that you do for peace and have done all your life. You're a fantastic campaign. The OSCE was formed, as you say, 50 years ago, and it should have been the vehicle that was used for further demilitarization in Europe at the end of the Cold War. The Warsaw Pact had collapsed. That was the time for NATO to horn itself in a bit, and you could have then had a much more rational future for Central Europe. And for the last 5 years, I've been a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which has become an increasingly mobilizing place for NATO interests in war, rather than what it was traditionally set up as being a Council of Europe 1948 that included all of the Eastern European countries and all of Western Europe. It was the one place where parliamentarians from both sides of the Iron Curtain could meet, and they did meet. And that was a very, very important place for people to come together. It's now changed into something, sadly, very, very different. The OSCE should have been the organization that grew much more after 1990 in order to bring about security and cooperation across Europe, which meant, and it did work for a while, it did mean reduction of warheads, the reduction of directional warheads, the reduction in the number of nuclear missiles and nuclear warheads, and all countries reduced the number of nuclear warheads, and there was systematic inspection of both sides in doing that. Maybe it wasn't done as quickly as Paul or I yourself would have wanted, but it did happen, and it was going ahead. The problem is we turned the corner in the late 1990s and 2000s, where we're now in breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty by the expansion of our nuclear arms capacity, and a number of countries are realizing that you can get away with it, so they are in danger of leaving the whole NPT process. But I'll just say this on nuclear weapons. It's really serious. Next month, I'm going to Japan to be there for the 80th commemoration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those weapons that killed hundreds of thousands ultimately were actually less than the power of one warhead that this country's got, much less than the power. They were actually quite small nuclear explosions compared to what we've got now. People need to wake up. Once somebody sets off a nuclear weapon, it don't stop there. You've then got the environmental impact, the enormous death rate, the destruction, the pollution, and a nuclear winter which will destroy crops all over the world. What then happens is famine and starvation across the whole planet as a result of a nuclear war. Would any rational human being ever think of using a weapon that can actually set off a chain reaction to destroy the whole planet? The cause of nuclear disarmament and nuclear peace is now and very, very important.
Jeremy, we're up to, in fact, we're beyond time, I'm sorry to say, but thank you very much for that. Thank you very much also, Jinsella. It's been really worthwhile. Let me leave you with these points. I think we all know that we're facing very difficult times, that in fact, if anything, it's gone the wrong way over the last 10 years or so. That does not mean it can't be turned around. And that is embodied in the many different organizations that are trying to do this. I think for any one person who may have a concern with one aspect of the wider problem, it can be very disconcerting, very undermining, because you think you're on your own, but you're not. And the point is, there are so many people who feel the same way in different aspects, that when you put them all together, it's much more significant than you realize. I think we have to remember that when we feel really down by the scale of what we have to do. Change can come. And if you remember at the time of the Greenham Women actions in 1983-84, at that time, if we'd had a meeting like this with this number of people, what would have been right at the center of people's concerns would have been the risk of all-out global nuclear war. We still have dangers now, but they're not at the same level. And that's not least because I think of the skill of just one or two leading politicians, including Gorbachev at a particular time, and a very strong feeling across much of the world, certainly the northwestern world, that we had to go a different way. We got out of that, and we can get out of this as well. But that really is incumbent on all of us to know what we're about, to be confident, and to spread the word the whole time. It seems to me that this kind of event is a classic way of being able to stimulate that. I'm delighted we've had our two speakers. I particularly welcome Jeremy and his lifelong commitment to this. And let's hope that we see you all here next year and we see the first signs of progress. Thank you for coming.
Peace.